Good evening, dear friends. Thank you for joining this conversation on this co-hosted conversation by Rumi and JIDS on resisting injustice peacefully. A debate that we are not unfamiliar with, and a homework that seems to be continue to challenge humanity in the future times also. So, and I'm happy, thankful to our speakers this evening, Dr. Sophia Pandya and Rabbi Michael Pollack. I will just quickly move into the introduction. I'll introduce Dr. Sophia Pandya and give her the floor. So, Dr. Pandya is currently a full professor and department chair at California State University at Long Beach in the Department of Religious Studies. She has received her BA from UC Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies and Arabic, and her MA and PhD from UC Santa Barbara in Religious Studies. A Fulbright scholar, she specializes in women and Islam, and more broadly in contemporary movements within Islam. Her interests have also included religious change in Yemen among both the younger and older generations of women and the ways with which they negotiate conflicting religious discourses. So Dr. Pandya has extensive research on gender, social movements, and religion in the Islamic world. Dr. Pandya. Please.
Let's try that again. Good evening, and it's so nice to be here tonight. Such an honor, and thank you, Dr. Anli, for that elaborate introduction. Let me share screen with you because I like to show some images when I speak. I'm going to talk about social justice in Islam. And so this image here is of the Women's March I took the picture, Women's March in California. And you see a woman wearing a headscarf, and she's actually standing right next to a gay pride flag. And so the title is Peaceful Social Justice and Islam. And I want to begin with the Quran. And there's a verse in the Quran that says, "And the firmament has he raised high, and he has set up the balance of justice." And then the image here is of one of the 99 names of God, which is Al-Adil, which means the utterly just. Of course, if I were giving this, if I could switch this up, I would say he, she, they has set up the balance of justice. So in general, Muslims, when I intersect with this talk, I have to note that Muslims themselves have been targeted by horrible bigotry and social injustice, right? They've survived profound social injustice in the United States and in Europe in particular in recent years and before. And also that theologically Islam has always centralized justice and social justice. That has been part of the Islamic message since the beginning days of Islam. And yet some Islamic communities have historically engaged in qualified justice versus complete equality. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And here you have another image. I took this image. It's of a young man. He's actually sitting in a wheelchair, and he's taking pictures of the women's, not the Women's March. This one is of the Muslim ban, the demonstration against the Muslim ban that took place at LAX airport. And of course, his t-shirt says it all, "Stop blaming Muslims." And he has an American flag. You have contemporary progressive modernist Muslims. They've called for a more equal form of social justice than, say, traditionalist Muslims. Another image from the Women's March, and you see a woman wearing a headscarf that's US flag headscarf. And again, when we think about social justice, there's a lot of injustice, not just for Muslims, but also for Jews and also people of color right now. And it's just, heightened these days because of the global pandemic and also the recent attacks at the Capitol. And so you've got this idea that the Great Replacement theory and a lot of the people that took part in the attack at the Capitol were white supremacists. And some of those subscribe to the white replacement theory. It argues that whites in America are being replaced by Jews and Muslims and peoples of Middle East and Africa. And of course, it's racist, right? They're not escaping to find a better life. They're invading us to destroy ours, deport all illegals, build a wall, et cetera, et cetera. We're both of our communities are very familiar with that. But going back to Islam and justice in general, so the earliest days of the Islamic community, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, spoke about empathy for, commitment to the poor and marginalized, even small animals. And Islam itself emphasizes tawheed, which is absolute oneness. And so if you have tawheed of God, that should be reflected on earth. And so humanity should also be absolute oneness. You shouldn't have hierarchy, you shouldn't have hegemony, you definitely shouldn't have discrimination or social injustice. So this here you have tawheed, the oneness of God. Islam obligates Muslims to act against all forms of injustice. Of course, Muslims understand that obligation in different ways, but the principle is there, that Muslims are absolutely supposed to stand up and act against all forms of injustice. And so what does God in Islam say about social justice? So the idea is that God created the universe to see justice, and that one of the 99 names of God, of course, is justice, or the just. God can never be unjust. Humans are supposed to model God. They should never be unjust. They are supposed to act with compassion for the marginalized, for the vulnerable. They confront zulma, which is injustice or oppression. And they should confront that whenever they see it, with their hands and their tongue, more importantly, and finally with their heart. Although with their heart, that's considered to be a weaker form of social activism. You're supposed to literally not be a bystander, to stand up and confront it. And so this is also, Islamically, it's understood that this stand against injustice is shared by the other monotheisms, you know, with all of the other prophets, right? That they're on the side of the oppressed. And so the Quranic verse here, this image says, "O you who believe, stand firm for justice, even against your own selves." Oh, one more little point here. There are, you know, Muslims are obliged to create just social systems on earth. Now, of course, you know, that's you know, obviously easier said than done, but they're supposed to strive towards that. It's supposed to be something that a Muslim would, each Muslim should strive as part of his, her, or their duty. And then you have the prophetic example. The Prophet himself, peace be upon him, was an orphan, experienced all forms of discrimination. He had some nicknames that reflected upon his own character as a just person. He was known as Sadiq al-Amin, which means honest and trustworthy. He was known to meditate in caves on Mount Hira on how to solve the social injustices of the day. He was disgusted with the proto-capitalism and greed that he witnessed in Mecca, and wanted to, you know, he was trying to figure out, I mean, what should be done to help people. And this is a Quranic verse: "O ye who believe, if ye fear Allah, he will grant you a criterion to judge between right and wrong. Remove from you all evil that afflict you and forgive you, for Allah is the Lord of grace abounded." And that's from the Quran 8:29. He also spoke against racism, religious bigotry, charging interest on a loan, which creates incredible social, financial inequity, right? Economic inequity, credit card debt, and, you know, just paying back loans. So you're not supposed to charge interest on a loan in Islam. Of course, this is a problem because Muslims do buy houses with loans and things like that. So that's a longer conversation. In Medina, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, began by instructing people to engage in, quote, supporting the weak, helping the oppressed, spreading peace. And he even spoke about assisting those without faith or from another faith. This is just an image here of a talk that Omar Suleiman gave on 40 hadiths on social justice. A hadith is one of the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Amongst the tools of Islamic social justice include zakat. So Muslims, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is that you have to give 2.5% of your wealth to the poor. And then there's waqf, and those are charitable organizations or endowments. And there's also sadaqah, that's additional forms of charitable donations. And Muslims are told over and over and over again that they should give, that, you know, if your neighbor is hungry, that's actually, it's more important to give food to your neighbor than to your own brother who's further away. Okay, the person next to you, you have to feed that person if that person is hungry. Here's another Quranic verse. Alms are for the poor and the needy, and those employed to administer the funds, for those whose hearts have been recently reconciled to truth, for those in bondage and in debt, in the cause of Allah, and for the wayfarer. Thus it is ordained by Allah, and Allah is full of knowledge and wisdom. And that's verse 960. But of course, you know, you have different camps within the Muslim community when it comes to actually applying social justice or the practice of social justice. And I know this is also true in the Jewish community. So in the Muslim community, you have your traditionalists, and they tend to frown on ijtihad or new interpretations of the Quran and the Hadith. And they often, you know, they also believe in justice and social justice, but it's contingent on older understandings of the text, on literal understandings of the text, and oftentimes it's qualified. For example, so justice would be that a daughter would inherit 1/3 of her parents' wealth while the son would inherit 2/3. And there's reasons for that because, you know, in Islam, the man is supposed to be fully financially responsible. But today, of course, modernists are saying, why are we doing this? Why would a girl only inherit 1/3? But that would be like a qualified form of justice or a complementary form of justice. So modernists tend to apply reason to the Quran and also to the Hadith. Again, the Hadith is the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad collected. And they apply the, you know, modern contexts when they look at the, you know, the texts and also their own reason. And so those include a group known as progressive Muslims. These, that group came about after 9/11, 2001. You have the group organized progressive Muslims. And then you also have the Hizmet movement, also known as the Gülen movement. They have been around for several decades. And then you also have other groups, reformists, other liberal Muslim communities. I can't list them all. But those tend to argue for pluralism and for a truer or closer form of social justice, race, gender, class, sometimes even sexual orientation. Especially the progressive Muslims believe in combating discrimination against sexual orientation. And one of the things that they do differently than the traditionalists is that they tend to prioritize the Quran over the Hadith, especially the progressive Muslims. They look closely at the Quran and they say that this is more important. This text is more important than the Hadith because it's the words of God and not, you know, not just collections made by humans of the sayings and doing of the Prophet Muhammad. So Omid Safi edited a very famous book called Progressive Muslims on gender, on justice, gender, and pluralism. And I'm not going to read this whole quote here, but they, you know, one of their statements is that they have a commitment to transform society from an unjust one where people are mere objects of exploitation by governments, socioeconomic institutions, and unequal relationships. So you're supposed to work to transform that, and that's based on gender, based on sexual orientation, based on whatever. You have to transform it to be based on just relationships. And this is, you know, the Hizmet movement, the inspirational founder behind the Hizmet movement is a gentleman named Fethullah Gülen. He has a quote here about social justice. I'll just read it. Only a few people seem to realize that social harmony and peace with nature, between people and within the individual can come about can only come about when the material and spiritual realms are reconciled. So he thinks, in part that the rise of Western materialistic culture has led to social injustice because it's led to greed. Here's another famous book, The Quran of the Oppressed, Liberation Theology and Gender Justice in Islam by Shadab Rahmatullah. And this is a very famous woman, Amina Wadud, yes, is leading prayer for Muslims. So she is a member of the Progressive Muslim Organization, and she actually led prayer for Muslims, which is sort of unheard of in Islam. Only men can lead prayer if men and women are in the community. But she broke that barrier. In Los Angeles, we have something called the Women's Mosque of America, and only women can show up. You don't have to cover your hair. Muslims for Progressive Values, this is, they have a branch in LA. They believe, they're very, very liberal. They believe that in every form of absolute equality of humans. And so here you see solidarity with Muslim, LGBTQ, Allah loves us, etc. This is a Hizmet-sponsored, to the left you see an image of a Hizmet-sponsored conference that I actually attended in Brussels, Countering Violent Extremism. And then to the right you see a group of Muslim young men, they're college students. They're from Texas, and it had to do with standing up against domestic violence against women. So you see Muslims say yes to women's rights. Another very famous book, Quran, Liberation and Pluralism by Farid Isaac, and Believing Women in Islam, Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Quran by Asma Barlas. So that's interesting. I use these books to teach my classes, actually. Unreading Patriarchy, it's very interesting. But when we think about, social justice and religion is one of the last bastions of bigotry, in fact, and also perhaps one of the keys, at least, to peace. But see, on the left you have, on the right you have, I'm not a bigot, it's just my religion. And again, some of the people that stormed the Capitol belong to the QAnon group, which is, it's a quasi-religious community, and they have this whole mythology, and they think that they're saving the world. They believe that they are standing up like Luke Skywalker against Darth Vader, okay? And it's this idea that, when you have religiously fueled bigotry, there's often a worldview that person is standing with God against evil. And thus the bigotry is not bigotry, it's God's will, it's God's punishment. In fact, it's God's, it's God doing it. I'm just a vehicle for God. So how do we escape this cycle of religiously fueled violence? All right, we have to consider the 7 factors that cause religiously fueled violence in the first place. And one of them is a lack of religious education. People that don't understand their own religion oftentimes jump to quick answers. And, it's easy for them to be manipulated into thinking something very simplistic about their religion. Another factor that causes religiously fueled violence is this desire to belong. I'm sure that, the people that have joined QAnon, that they reflect that, the desire to belong. Also people that join ISIS, the desire to belong. And then groupthink. Once you belong to something, you start thinking like the group. And then there's this concept of exclusivism. My group is better than your group. I'm superior. In fact, God's shining on my group. In fact, your group's polluted. I might as well help God send you polluted people, to hell. And then, there's a search for meaning, especially today. We are meaning deprived, many of us. We search for meaning. Sometimes we scroll at night with our iPhones until, we feel like we can't find it. I'm looking for something on my iPhone. I can't find what I'm looking for. And what I'm looking for is some meaning to my life. And that search for meaning sometimes has people joining groups that are, willing to cause religiously fueled violence. And then there's this worldview of the cosmic battle, that I am fighting against evil. Evil is this group over here. God's shining on my group. And then gender plays a role. Those men that feel emasculated, they feel dishonored, they feel small, or they feel as though they are marginalized. Sometimes they want to reorder society. They see society as being awry, and they want to reorder it violently, to be ordered in a way that, often where you see the restoration of patriarchy, and also patriarchal understandings of religion. So what do we do? Of course, to work against that, you just look at each one and you think about how to work against those. But we have to find ways to embrace and include young people in our community, those at risk, those marginalized, those angry. We can't hug anybody right now, but we have to try to draw those close that we fear, humanize them, create youth programs for them. And regardless of ideology or religion, leaders in general should pointedly teach humanitarianism and empathy, the value of a complex world, independent critical thinking, diversity, and belief. They should offer courses on the world's different cultures and religious traditions in secondary schools, emphasizing universality, commonalities between peoples, instead of religious exclusivism or cultural particularism. And I want to say happy birthday to Martin Luther King. We're just a few days after, Martin Luther King's birthday here. And here's a quote by the famous King. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. And so in conclusion, Muslims have interpreted the text and the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in different ways. However, Islamic texts and the model of the Prophet Muhammad have always demonstrated concern for social justice in regards to the relationship between individuals and society. So I'm concluding with a quote by the Quran 4:40 here. Indeed, Allah does not do injustice, even as much as an atom's weight. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Fascinating, really it was. So our second and final speaker, before we start with the Q&A, will be Rabbi Michael Pollack. Rabbi Pollack is a local boy from Rockville, Maryland, who was ordained by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia and stayed in the Keystone State ever since. He's the founder and executive director of March on Harrisburg, an anti-corruption, pro-democracy organization devoted to cleaning up a state that, may not surprise you, ranks among the most corrupt in the nation. His organization's projects include ending gerrymandering, instituting a gift ban, and automatic voter registration. And his organization is a proud coalition member of the Pennsylvania Poor People's Campaign. Rabbi Pollack is inspired by prophets, spelled with a PH, far more than prophets, spelled with an F. And this is reflected in the fact that as a grassroots activist, he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk, as I am sure you will hear. And I have been honored to know him since he and my daughter Hannah were first-year rabbinical students together, and shared a home together, shared a house. So it's great to have you speak at our forum.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's really great to be here with everybody. And Sophia, that was a great presentation. That was really informative. Thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to the discussion in a few minutes. So the theme of this talk is, of this event is resisting injustice, which is incredibly important. But I want us to also transition to pursuing justice, that we don't just resist injustice, we also have to aggressively pursue justice. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 16, tzedek tzedek tirdof lema'an tichiyeh. Justice, justice you must pursue so that you may live. So beyond resisting injustice, we have to aggressively pursue justice because that's where life is, so that we may live. At March on Harrisburg, we focus on resisting the injustices of corruption. That's our main set of injustices that we focus on, and also pursuing justice through democracy. So I'd like to just tell a story to kind of get at kind of how we approach these issues. A few years ago, I was in Jerusalem, and after classes a few blocks away from the Old City on Tuesday afternoons, I would go walking through the Old City of Jerusalem, and I would just be a tourist. And one day I stumbled into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a big holy site for the Christian religion. And I walked in and I saw this giant shrine on the inside of the church, off to the left, and out of the shrine was a long line of pilgrims, religious people who had come from all over the world to have an incredibly meaningful religious experience. And they were crying, and they were holding incense, and they were holding beads and prayer books and weeping, and it was very emotional. And being a Jewish tourist in a Christian holy site, with my backpack on and my camera out, I walked around to the back of the shrine. And in the back of the shrine, I saw a closet. And in the closet were two men wearing monk's clothes. And they were sorting money. They had dollars, they had dinar, they had yen, they had euro, they had shekels, they had all of the currencies of the world that had come to that holy site. And I couldn't believe it right there. This was about 6 years ago. There they are. There are the money changers at the temple. And it blew me away. And I thought, my God, what am I seeing right here? And so I went to Bethlehem, not Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the original Bethlehem, and I talked with a Palestinian Christian friend of mine, and I told him what I had seen. I said, what do you think about this? You know, this is pretty shocking to me. It's incredible to see this. And he said, the church is not in a good place right now. He said, what happens is leadership comes from the outside. They're not homegrown. They're being appointed from somebody who lives in outside of the land. The money that comes in through tourism, through holy sites, through all of this, it stays at the top. It never quite trickles down, never quite manages to trickle down. And he says, what you end up with is priests driving BMWs while people go hungry. And he said, the churches are closing down. And he said, thank God it's not the state, it's just the church, because we can go to another church. The Pentecostals have opened up shop. The Baptists are moving in. It's tough, it's painful, but it's not the end. And he said that the church, and he said, if this was the state that's failing, where do you go? When the state fails, what do you do? And he said, he described the corruption in the church. He said that the church is like a body. And I think he was quoting Paul on this one. He said that the church is like a body, and what we're seeing is a decapitation. We're seeing the heads of state, the heads of the church are separated from the body politic, are separated from the body. And what happens then is that the body stumbles around and it collapses. And as it's stumbling, people get hurt. It flails. He said the head of the institution is not connected to the hands. It's not connected to the toes. It's not connected to the kidneys. It's not connected to the heart. And the head is drifted away. And so in March on Harrisburg, what we focus on is attaching the head to the body, attaching the heads of state to the body politic. And every policy we work on is a stitch. Gift ban is a stitch. Ending gerrymandering is a stitch. And they just one by one, we are building a democracy through reattaching the head to the body. So before we keep going here, I just want to take a second to talk about what is corruption. What is the nature of corruption? How does this operate? Why is this important? Corruption, it says in Deuteronomy, right after it says, justice, justice, you must pursue it, it says, do not take a bribe. I'm going to do the Hebrew. Lo tikach shochad. Do not take a bribe. Ki shochad ya'aver einei chachamim, because a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and it twists the words of the righteous. So what bribes do is they blind people from seeing reality. They blind the head from seeing the body. They deafen the head from hearing the body. And what this does in the end, the Talmud in Ketubot 105b and the Talmud, they go into this. They keep asking the question, what is this? And they determine that when you have a bribe, what you're doing is you're creating a small group to the exclusion of everyone else. right? I'm mixing metaphors here because there's just so many metaphors for corruption. The head is detached from the body. The small group is separated from the public, right? And for those who know Talmudic Hebrew, it's based off of a pun, so I just have to share it. Shochad is the word for bribe, and they turn that into shehu echad, when you become one with the other in a small group to the exclusion of everybody else. And this is the phenomenon that Isaiah described in chapter 1. I believe it was verse 23. Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves, right? They're part of the small group with thieves. They chase after bribes. The widow and the orphan's cause does not come before them. When you have this disconnect, when they're blinded, deafened to what's happening in reality, to what's happening in the body, they just don't know. They just don't hear. They just don't see. Right? The widow and the orphan's cause does not come before them. In Pennsylvania, and this is a very Pennsylvania specific talk because that's where I operate. 1 in 8 of our children live in deep poverty. 1 in 2 of our children live in poverty. They don't get a hearing in the state house. Nobody cares. There's a state rep who was one of our champions on the gift ban, and he pulled me aside one day and he says, I see people here fighting for a lot of things. There's the insurance people, there's Comcast lobbyists, there's the natural gas people, there's the opioid people. He said, nobody is here fighting for the single mother. Nobody is here fighting for the homeless veteran. Nobody is here fighting for the widow and the orphan. And the more time you spend in Capitol buildings across the country, I imagine this is true. This is not just true for Pennsylvania. This is a national trend. You see that. You see that the people who are in the building are the bribers. Partners with thieves. Our rulers are partners with thieves. Ezekiel says that there are those in you who take bribes to shed blood. This is very true today. In Pennsylvania, we have the Pain Care Forum, who push opioids, have 87 lobbyists in Harrisburg, the most per capita for any state, and we have an opioid epidemic. People are getting hurt. We have 203 registered natural gas lobbyists in Harrisburg. That's 1 for every state representative. And Pennsylvania produces 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. This is violence through corruption, through bribery. Bribes blind the eyes of the wise, and they twist the words of the righteous. So that's the problem that we're after. And what we do as March on Harrisburg, here's how we resist the injustice and pursue justice. We organize. We are a statewide, volunteer-driven, nonpartisan group. And what we do is we lobby. We've lobbied everybody in the Capitol building except for one white supremacist who won't take a meeting with us, but that's okay because he no longer is in power. And we lobby everybody many, many times over. We march. We've marched 265 miles. We engage in nonviolent direct action. We've done about 20 of them. I've gone to jail. I don't even know how many times anymore, to be honest with you all, somewhere in the 7 to 9 region in the past couple of years. And we have moved the gift ban bill out of its committee. We've moved open primaries through the full Senate. We've forced 5 hearings on gerrymandering. And about 1.5 years ago, we got our first legislative win. We passed the first electoral code rewrite in Pennsylvania since 1937. And that brought vote by mail to Pennsylvania for the first time and made a bunch of other necessary fixes. And we passed that with unanimous Republican support. Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. It was fun. All of our tactics in fighting for democracy and pursuing justice are based in the idea of the encounter. Because corruption separates us, because corruption decapitates the head, because corruption blinds the eyes, deafens the ears, we have to encounter. We have to be loud. We have to be seen. We have to force the encounter. And the hope is, or the faith, I guess we could say, the faith is that if we encounter each other, we want to help each other. That deep inside every human being is the desire to serve, the desire to be responsible for each other, the desire to help each other. And that if we see each other, if we hear each other's cries, we will want to help each other. Emmanuel Levinas, the French Jewish philosopher, said, when you see the face of the other, you are ordered and ordained to service. And it's that reaction of service, of public service, that we're after. And to get that reaction, we go for the encounter. So all of our tactics are based out of that idea. And frankly, that idea, this mutual responsibility, this perpetual communication, is one way to define what democracy is. We use democracy to fight for democracy. So when we lobby, first off, you have to lobby. You have to go talk to Pharaoh. You know, as much as Moses and Aaron don't want to go talk to Pharaoh, you got to go talk to Pharaoh. Even if Pharaoh's going to have a hardened heart, you got to go talk to Pharaoh. And I'd just like to tell a quick story from one lobbying visit. This was after our first big round of protests. We had 3 days of protests in the state capitol. 28 people got arrested. We disrupted committee hearings. We disrupted the annual Make the Second Amendment Great Again rally, which was a lot of fun to disrupt. Some legislators were not very happy with us. And so we met with one of them. She's a Republican from a very rural district. And for the first 15 minutes or so of the meeting, she was furious. I mean, quivering to keep from screaming, biting her lip literally to keep from screaming at us, absolutely furious, because that white supremacist committee chair I referenced earlier is her friend. They're close. And she was very upset with us on his behalf. And at one point she said, I don't even know why you're here, because according to my Judeo-Christian values, I'm only responsible for my own behavior. And I don't take any gifts. I'm not corrupt. So what are you doing? I said, well, actually, according to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the entire Hebrew Bible can be summarized with the phrase, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And thank you for not being guilty, for not taking any bribes, but you are responsible for what your colleagues do. When the first brother killed his brother, when Cain killed Abel, and God comes in and says, where is your brother? And Cain's response is, am I my brother's keeper? The entire Bible, the answer is yes. Yes, you are co-responsible. You are responsible for your colleagues. And she completely understood. Her demeanor completely changed. And she said, okay, I'll go talk to him. And she walked right out, went down the hall and talked to him. And he yelled at her. And so be it. We also march. We do a lot of marching. Again, 265 miles. We've done 3 long-term marches, Philadelphia to Harrisburg twice, Lancaster to Harrisburg once, and we would have already done York to Harrisburg, but there was a pandemic. So here we are, one day. It's such a beautiful walk too. I'm really excited to do York to Harrisburg, and I hope people on this call, if you're interested, you can come up. It's right along the river. It's a beautiful, beautiful walk through central PA. We might get stuck behind some horse and buggies, but that's okay. We're going to be going slower than them anyway. When we march, you have to go to Nineveh. In the story of Jonah, he doesn't want to go to the capital. He doesn't want to go talk to the king. He doesn't want to go march to the seat of the empire and tell them to give up the injustice that's in their hands. But you have to. It's so much easier to run away to Tarshish. It's so much easier to jump on a ship and head out into the sea. And most days, it's much more comforting to be in the stomach of a whale than it is to go into the Capitol building. It's dreadful, but you gotta go. You gotta march. And so we march. And when we march, we encounter each other. We encounter each other. We're walking and talking. You can't be on your phone at a march because you're gonna trip. So you have to, hands free, eyes up. You're talking with the person next to you. You're encountering each other. You're sleeping on church floors together, eating together, sweating together, struggling together, supporting each other. And it's a pilgrimage. It's a pilgrimage very much based, at least in my approach to it, in the biblical pilgrimages to the temple. This doesn't mean much in Reconstructionist settings, but I am a Kohen, which means I'm a descendant of the priestly caste who was in charge of the temple and whose corruption helped bring about the end of the temple twice. We go to the temple, and our temples, our civic temples, are very much our temples of our time. If you look at the architecture of state capitol buildings, of the US Capitol building, there's domes, there's rotundas, there's pillars of marble, they're elevated up high, you have to climb steps. This is the design of ancient Mediterranean temples. That's what these are. And these are the seats of power, and so we have to go. So we march to the temple. And when we get to the temple, what do? You sacrifice. That's what you do when you're at the temple. You offer a sacrifice. And so that's what we do. We sacrifice. And the ancient Hebrew word, the biblical word for sacrifice, is korban. And korban, and I know I believe in Arabic it's korbanya. It's a very similar word, which I'd love to talk more about in a few minutes. And korban, the root of it is lehakriv, which means to encounter, to draw near. In modern Hebrew, it sometimes means to hug, to embrace somebody is to make a sacrifice. Because what you're doing is you're trying to encounter the divine, you're trying to encounter your highest and holiest ideals. And in our case, we're trying to encounter our elected officials. We're trying to encounter our politicians so that they will see the face of the other and be ordained and ordered to service. And so when we are in the Capitol, we sacrifice, we force the encounter. They can't look away. We're in the hallway, we're blocking their way, right? They can't look away. We're sitting in the front of their committee hearing. They can't look away. We're in their office. They can't look away. They have to look at the face of suffering and deal with it. And we hope that they respond with service. We hope that the Korban is met with blessing. The priestly blessing that was said at the temple by the Kohens, it's Yevarecha Adonai v'yismerecha, may the divine, may God bless and protect you. May the face, thank you, Herb. May the face of the divine turn to you and be gracious to you, right? May the face of the divine shine on you and may there be peace. The whole idea of the sacrifice is to turn God's face toward us, to turn our faces toward each other, to have that response of sympathy, that response of responsibility, that response of love. And so that's what we're doing in the Capitol, and it works. It keeps working. It's incredible, and it's hard for me to even describe without using words like phenomenon. It's inexplicable sometimes how people react. For example, the House Majority Leader was stalling on us on the gift ban this fall. And he was new in the role. The old speaker resigned. Everybody moves up a leg on the ladder. He's the new majority leader. And so we encountered him at his district office in Center County, Pennsylvania, pretty rural area, Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. And we attempted to bribe him very openly and very ironically. We attempted to give him a cash gift, which is legal, of $1.02. Because Article 1, Section 2 of the Pennsylvania State Constitution says that all power is inherent in the people. And that can't be true as long as corruption is legal. And we offered the bribe. Not much happened. Next week, we went right back into the Capitol building. And we did, outside of his office, we did what one reporter referred to as a passion play, which just really cracked me up when I saw that. We explained what they look like to the public. We did a skit, about a 30-minute long skit where we basically had lobbyists interacting with politicians, corrupt money flying every which way, people of Pennsylvania suffering as it all happens. And after that, he said, okay, let's meet. Let's do this. And the next week, came back into the Capitol building. We sat down. They opened by returning the bribe. They had an envelope with $1.02 in it, same exact dollar that we had. It was a very torn up dollar. And they said, okay, we're going to pass a gift ban next year. We're in. Let's do it. And so every time we do a direct action, it keeps moving the ball forward. Every time we force the encounter, we get progress because people see it and they want to respond with service. And I'm just going to close with a reminder that resisting injustice and pursuing justice is risky stuff. That when we're doing this intensely and aggressively, there are consequences. Systems of injustice protect themselves. Corrupt politicians look out for each other. Lobbyists look out for them. The donors look out for their lobbyists. It's tough. And so I'm just reminded of the quote when I grad, because doing this event takes me back to rabbinical school because I of course, went to rabbinical school with Hannah Spiro. Our closing ceremony at rabbinical school, every student gets a blessing from a rabbi. And the rabbi, Mordechai Liebling, he stepped forward, and the blessing he gave me was from George Carlin, "May evil grow confused on its way to your door." And so I hope that as we all resist injustice and pursue justice, that evil grows confused on its way to our door. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Right. Thank you so much. So I don't know exactly how it's normally done at the Rumi Forum, but Ibrahim allowed me to do this, so we're going to do it the way it's normally done in JIDS, which is going to be a lot of hearing from you guys.
So,
A lot of hearing from you guys.
So a note on the structure at Rumi Forum, we take pride having no established structure. That's the Rumi way.
All right. Awesome. So You don't have to just ask questions. You can make statements. Just keep them relatively short. And if you have something to say, just say in the chat room, you know, I'd like to be called on. While we're getting the first set of volunteers, and please don't be shy, let me start these guys out with something to raise their blood pressures, because they look way too healthy. So I'm from DC also, and most folks in my hometown are talking about how foreseeable it was that there would be violence when the president claimed the election was stolen and called for people to fight back. We all, in Blue America, we're hearing about that all the time. But as a dialogue guy, I also know a lot of people from Red America. And they've been talking about how violence often results from marches against injustice. And of course, they're throwing out a very different point. So I'm asking you, how do you differentiate between finding politicians like the president liable for inciting the Capitol building riot and not holding organizers of the BLM marches liable when they call for people to fight against injustice and violence occurs? I thought I'd start out with a little softball.
Okay,
So
yeah.
whoever wants to start, please do.
That's quite a softball.
I know, I can do worse.
Yeah. Well, I live in Long Beach, and we had, we had some peaceful protests by the Black Lives Matter movement, but we also had parallel rioting. And this is different than what happened at the nation's capital, right? You had Trump calling people to get wild, to come to the Capitol and get wild. And meanwhile, you know, on many QAnon and 4chan websites, there was a lot of dialogue about going to the Capitol and actually hurting people. So in Long Beach, and I had looting happening right next to my house, right? But it wasn't the BLM movement that was involved with the looting. Those were just two parallel events. But in Washington, this was the president saying, "Come and get wild."
So if he had not used the word wild, if he had just said fight, that's the line drawing?
Maybe trial by combat was the line. There are a lot of things said.
I mean, I guess that's sort of, so my question is, it's exactly what one says in leading a protest, and the line is drawn based on your precise words. Fighting is fine, getting wild is not fine.
I actually think that we should be careful with the word fight these days. I think, you know, he should have said, yes, please come and peacefully protest. If you agree with me that, you know, if you want to stop the steal, right, to come peacefully protest. And he didn't say that. Those were not his words. Words matter.
Words do matter.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Rabbi.
As Sophia was just saying, you know, Black Lives Matter never calls for violence, right? There's never calls for violence coming from the top. Things happen when people are oppressed and when people, when the voice of the unheard is heard. It can often be heard like thunder, and it's loud and it cracks. But I really want to focus on, you know, just the need to build a working class movement across lines of division, and that means across lines of urban, suburban, rural, blue, red, liberal, conservative, because that's where the future is. That's where resisting injustice really lies, and pursuing justice really lies. That protest I was just talking about, where we did that passion play outside of the majority leader's office, that same day there was a Second Amendment protest happening on the Capitol steps. Pennsylvania is a huge, huge gun state. As one state senator once told me, there's 1 million deer hunting licenses, you know, at one point in Pennsylvania's history. Just a few decades ago, that was the peak. Pennsylvania is also #1 in armed anti-government hate groups per capita. We have plenty of Nazis, plenty of Confederate flags, especially ironically near Gettysburg in central PA. But we need to be connecting across lines of division. So that protest that we had, so there was the gun protest, they came in. I was actually being arrested at this point, so I didn't see this happen, but it happens often, where they came up to us and they saw our purple color. And their first thing one of them said was, "Are you a new political party? Because we are sick and tired of the Republicans. We're sick and tired of them. They don't do anything. Nothing changes. Please, please." And it was a great conversation. And our people, they started talking to a few of our Black members about Black Lives Matter. And our Black members said, you know, this is a problem that also affects white people. They acknowledged that there was a 12-year-old white child who had actually just been shot by police that week. And so they brought him up, and they were able to forge that common bond of sympathy, to form that relationship through this encounter. And that's the type of working class organizing that we need to be constantly pursuing in order to pursue justice.
Thank you. Sant Gupta was the first one on the chat room to ask, or to say he wants to say something, but then I noticed that he also said, can the speaker address the specific issue that you raised? Please do not conflate or deflect the two events. I actually think that the professor did address my question, at least my first question. So Rabbi, I want to ask you, and maybe I'll rephrase it a little bit. As someone, I've been marching all my life. I went to Resurrection City in 1968. I was not that old in 1968. So this is part of life in Washington, D.C., right? What is the lesson after all that we've been hearing from the Capitol building and Blue America? What is the lesson about those of us who call for marches and who use words like, we've got to fight against injustice, which has been used at every march I've ever been to? Should we all go to jail? Or how do you respond to this?
Yeah, to hear the people in the Capitol 2 weeks ago saying things like, this is what democracy looks like, you know, and talking about election security and election integrity, it was blasphemous. I think that's the word to use here, because it's just not true. And fascist movements often adopt the language of democracy. Bolsonaro in Brazil he's on an anti-corruption kick. Duterte in Philippines, same idea. They come into power promising to drain the swamp, and then they just kind of redirect the swamp in their own direction. And that's about what they do. But just the difference between, I'm going to say something very controversial here. So I just want to put this out there.
Good.
And I'm going to put it in Mark Twain's words, if that's okay, because he says this concept better than I do. So this is a Mark Twain quote from a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. He says, "There were two reigns of terror." Or he's talking about the French Revolution. "There were two reigns of terror, if we would but remember it and consider it. The one wrought murder in hot passion, the other in heartless cold blood. The one lasted mere months, the other had lasted 1,000 years. The one inflicted death upon 10,000 persons, the other upon 100 million. But our shudders are all for the horrors of the minor terror, the momentary terror, so to speak. Whereas what is the horror of swift death by the axe compared with lifelong death from hunger, cold, insult, cruelty, and heartbreak? What is swift death by lightning compared with death by slow fire? A city cemetery could contain the coffins filled by that brief terror, which we have all been so diligently taught to shiver at and mourn over. But all France could hardly contain the coffins filled by that older and real terror, that unspeakably bitter and awful terror which none of us has been taught to see in its vastness or pity as it deserves." And so when I hear people complaining the protests of Black Lives Matter and the destruction that's happening and the looting, it almost it sounds so inane to me. I'm just to be honest here, just to be real, because 750 people a day are dying from symptoms of poverty in the United States of America. 89 million people are uninsured. There's 1 in 8 kids in Pennsylvania is in deep poverty. There's a hunger crisis happening right now. People are dying from this system day in and day out. The looting that's happening is constant, and it's going upward. It's an upward looting that's been happening constantly, to the point where our income and wealth inequality is just off the charts. I mean, it's worse than pre-Great Depression levels at this point. It's worse than French Revolution levels. That's how bad it is. And so that constant looting is what I'm focused on. I don't care about a bunch of people burning down a Walgreens. I do care. Of course it's wrong. We all know it's wrong. But that's not the focus. I care about Walgreens jacking up the price on insulin so that diabetics die. That's what I care about.
So Sant Gupta and Helen Grin in that order. And then Maria Axner. Sant, unmute yourself.
Okay, so I'm raising these questions. I don't like to see that two issues conflated. Yes, what happened on 6th of January was despicable. There is no excuse for that. But let's keep that away from what happened all summer long, and all the destruction to the small business, and what happened in Portland, I do not hear many people raising the issue of the destruction and all the looting that went on. Is that something that was encouraged by who? Who encouraged that? Are you blaming the capitalistic system for that?
Yes, I will.
Okay, now you can, but is the $2 billion worth of destruction of property justified?
No, never. I'm not.
Many people raised their voices to say don't, and told those rioters, stop. I didn't hear much.
I mean, I personally did, but also I yelling at people who are incredibly desperate and are backed into a corner and lashing out from a place of desperation. You got to solve the underlying issues. I think you mourn for the looting and you mourn for the destruction, and it's bad, and of course it should be condemned. But the real work is building up the system where that doesn't need to happen. I mean, I walked through downtown Philly the first night of looting in Philadelphia. It was a Saturday afternoon. People were massed outside of City Hall. They burned down the Starbucks right there next to City Hall. It went up in flames. They tried to charge into City Hall. I'm standing right there in the corner just observing all of this. They charged City Hall. The police wall knocked them back. They charged again. They threw stuff at the building with intent to burn it down. The police knocked them back. They all went down south from City Hall into Rittenhouse Square, which is where the Apple store is, which is where all of these big high-end luxury chains are, and they started looting. And what I saw was people going into sporting goods stores and into Walgreens and taking diapers and baby formula and socks and shirts. There was definitely opportunistic looting where people were trying to take things out of greed, and then there was looting from a place of I can't make ends meet. I can't pay the bills this month. And so I don't want to just say to focus only on the looting. I feel like we're missing the broader point, which is what kind of a system produces that type of desperation and violence? And we have to address that.
So can I ask the professor if you want to add? You guys don't have to talk every time someone says something, but I want to give you an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the protests in Portland, for example, started with anti-police protests, and then, you know, you had people marching to defund the police or to restructure the police. And then they turned, you know, you have some people in the large group becoming violent, and then it spirals out of control. But I think it's gaslighting to always focus, just as Michael said, to always focus on, you know, what, you know, the looting that happened, and to ignore the roots of the anger in the first place. There's a lot of white supremacy up in Oregon. There's a lot of nasty stuff, you know, in terms of racism, bigotry, discrimination, police brutality in Oregon. And to ignore, you know, and to just focus on the consequences of that anger, I think is wrong.
So Helen Grin, you put something in the chat. Do you want to add to that?
Dan, thank you. I am going.
Okay.
I agree with both of the former speakers, and just the fact that the difference is that the fight for justice is not organized mayhem, all right? It doesn't appear to be any question that there was organized ideas to kill people and destroy in the Capitol. The Capitol is sacred. Luxury stores and Walgreens and Starbucks should not have been demolished, but they do not have the same consequence as invading the Capitol.
Okay. I believe Maria Axner was next.
I don't have a question. I'm sorry. It was
Okay.
answered in the
It was
text.
answered. Okay. Okay. All right. So I don't see any more. So let me ask another one. Another softball. So the rabbi spoke about not taking a bribe because it blinds the eyes of the wise and it twists the words of the righteous. And most of us, when we think about a bribe, we think about a public official taking money to determine how that official makes decisions in their official capacity. But what about the 2 trillion people every year that come to work for law firm X or company or lobbying company Y or whatnot? And because of that, these officials get to encounter, if you will, the companies that represent them. The judges get to encounter 9 different lawyers on this side of the room and only 1 on that side of the room. Do you liken that to a bribe? And isn't that the more sort of profound issue in our society than public officials actually taking money in terms of actually how things get done? So you want to take that one first, Rabbi, and then we'll go to the professor.
I want to make sure that I understand the question. So you're saying that just a large amount of money and resources that big corporations have automatically tilts the playing field in their favor in every situation.
I'm saying that lawyers, do they not, find their client to be correct all the time? Lobbyists, do they not find their client to be correct all the time?
Absolutely.
And when you have more money, you can hire these people. And the next thing you know, our society is changing in their direction. Are their eyes being blinded?
Yes.
Are their words being twisted? And is that bribery in your view? So I'm going to ask you right wing and left wing questions. I'm going to come at you from all directions tonight.
This is excellent. And that's how it is in the Capitol building, right? That's the whole range from democratic socialist to white nationalist. So yes, absolutely. I would say that is a bribe. So first of all, in US history, there was a time when lobbying was illegal. When to be paid to represent a business interest in the Capitol was seen as an incredibly unsavory, oftentimes illegal activity. I started catching on in the mid to late 1800s as the Gilded Age came into being, and then the tycoons came, the robber barons started operating. But yeah, we need to have conversations about lobbyist limits. How much can Citibank spend per year on lobbying? But that's really a conversation for a few years from now, because what we first have to do is disarm the lobbyists that are there, because they walk into these meetings with politicians armed. And not armed with guns, with bribes. So in Pennsylvania, you can walk into a legislator's office, put the keys to the brand new BMW right on their desk, and then hand them the bill with your other hand. And that's completely legal. There's no limits on that. You can literally walk in with a briefcase full of cash and put that in front of them. And that's legal. Literally, that's legal. Cash gifts, it's a thing. It blows my mind every time I say it. And then with even beyond the gifts, which are actually illegal on the federal level, thank you, Jackie Abramoff, you have campaign contributions, right? So here's another way to offer the bribes. Lobbyists have unlimited checkbooks. They can write campaign contribution checks for as much as they need to. They can recruit all of their friends to write checks so that they can evade the limits that are in place. Then you have dark money, the untraceable money. That's also an option to influence a politician. Politicians know that, oh my God, if I don't listen to this lobbyist, well then, $500,000 worth of mailers are going to show up in my district 2 days before the election that call me some unspeakably horrible thing that I don't have the time to rebut. And that happens pretty regularly. So there's so many ways that lobbyists can influence, immorally politicians. But of course, lobbyists and lawyers are necessary, right? Everybody deserves an organized voice. I want the ACLU to have an organized voice in the Capitol building, and that requires a lobbyist. I want somebody who's charged with a crime to have adequate legal defense. That requires a lawyer who's on their side. But if you're in a courtroom and the public defender is defending you, and they walk up to the judge and hand them an envelope and give them a wink and a nod, right? You can't do that. That just violates the whole trust. So to get at kind of what a definition of a bribe is, the Talmud tells four stories.
Okay, okay, you're not going to tell all 4, are you? You want to move on to other people.
Sounds good.
All right, Professor?
Okay, so bribery is a major sin in Islam. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, says, may the curse of Allah be upon the one who pays a bribe and the one who takes it. Okay, however, there is something called wasata, and wasata is intercession, and intercession can be good or bad. And so sometimes you can do something to intercede as long as the outcome is good. So in every religion, there's a loophole, right? Every religious rule has a loophole. So as long as you frame your so-called gift as intercession towards the public good, it can be that would not be considered to be a sin. What I tell my students is that religion is filled with these ideals, and humans can't reach them. It's just impossible. It's impossible to reach the ideals. We can only reach, and that's what we are supposed to do, is to reach the ideal of not using bribery. But definitely, if you're asking me if it's bribery, yes, it is definitely bribery. I agree with Rabbi Michael completely.
Okay, so I want to ask a question to the folks out, not in the panel, everybody else. We heard the word pilgrimage being used. I mentioned one of mine. Has anybody been on what you would call a resisting injustice pilgrimage, a march, something very special like that in your life that you wouldn't mind sharing with the rest of us? Because I especially those of you in Washington, D.C., I've got to think that you've been to marches that were particularly inspirational to you. If not, that doesn't say much for the value of marches.
Oh, my dear.
So can
Yeah.
somebody just said something, but I don't know who it is. Can you identify yourself?
Yes.
Go ahead.
A parent, a PGM parent, a mom. Oh, for the pictures, I want PGM.
All right.
Yes.
So I don't know who is not muted.
It's okay. Now
I think I just muted. Okay. So that's something to think about. If someone could ask to be called on in the chat room, I can ask another question, but I think we'd all really like to hear about pilgrimages, marches, anything you all have been on that have been particularly inspirational in your own life. In the meantime, I can ask another question.
Maybe Dan, before you do that, I would just say that
Sure.
it can be inspirational. They can also be perspirational. I was at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. There I was with tens of thousands of people my age who had massed in mostly a statement against the Vietnam War and in conflict with the powers that be with the Democratic Party. We peacefully assembled. I watched as the powers that be, the police, formed group phalanxes and beat their way into the crowd. So the inspiration there was to stand for peace and to stand for justice and to stand with my compatriots. The reality was that we were then countering the Democratic Party and having to deal with the police. So I have to say that year was a radicalizing year. In 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated, I watched as Washington burned. I was aware of my hometown, Baltimore, also having similar fires. I later went to work in a riot corridor in DC and was the only white person in an African-American neighborhood as a social worker. So the point is, I guess that each of these inspirations causes perspiration, and together and never as an individual can we stand for justice and make a difference.
Okay, in a moment, I want to call on Ibrahim, but I have to say something to bring the panel in first, based on what Herb just said. And by the way, there's a question in the chat. The two panelists shared titles of relevant written resources related to the subject. Okay, I think that would be very important. And you can see that in the chat, okay? So here's my question, relevant to your experience, Herb. I'm assuming that you were a Democrat in 1968 and you attended that convention and you were horrified.
No, I was a socialist, but yeah.
Okay. So I think we would all agree that most of the injustices, the fundamental injustices in this society, continue regardless of which party is in power. I don't think I'm going out on a ledge to make that statement. My question is, and this is really more, if we can put our Washington, D.C. hats on for those of us who are from D.C., and we're looking at the federal system. Do you find that in a two-party system, when your party is in power, you have less enthusiasm when it comes to protesting injustice, or your friends are less enthusiastic when it comes to protesting injustice, even though the fundamental injustices continue, regardless of which party is in power? You find that, you know, the energy in the room sort of goes away. And it's only when your party is out of power that everybody wants to go to take to the streets again. Or is this a phenomenon that I'm just making up? So let's start with the professor first. And you're muted.
Sorry, I was focusing on writing down.
You're still muted.
Oops, yeah, I was focusing on writing the sources. So if the rabbi could take it first.
When you get homework, it takes time. I get it.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember 2008 and when President Obama came in. That summer, I went and was working in the Democratic National Committee in the fundraising department and saw firsthand kind of the expectations meet reality. You know, had worked on the Obama campaign, believing in hope and change, believing in sweeping out corruption, changing the way we do things, healthcare as a human right, all of these things that we had fought for. And then in the fundraising committee, automatically right away, I just saw the checks coming in from Big Pharma, the checks coming in from this, you know, and the public option disappears, and you know, the corruption that followed all of that. And I think that after 2008, I think Democrats, Dan, I think the phenomenon you're naming was in full force at that point. I think people went to sleep. I think people went home. And on the other side, they got organized. They got organized with a lot of big money funding, but it was the Tea Party was grassroots. It does get called grass tops a lot, but there was a grassroots to it. And they organized and took back power. What I think is happening now that's a lot different is I think that Democratic voters and Republican voters are starting to see the political world not as a spectrum of Democrat to Republican, but as a spectrum of working class to ruling class. And that opens up new political coalitions that haven't formed in this country in quite some time. And when those political coalitions do form, that was like the Reconstruction era when poor white people and poor and recently freed slaves came together to take over state legislatures across the South and guarantee things like public education and send black senators to the U.S. Senate. That coalition came together again for the civil rights era, what can be called the second Reconstruction. And I like to think that we're heading into the third Reconstruction right now, which is language that Reverend William Barber's been using a lot. And I've seen this language also starting to show up in the Washington Post, which makes me really happy. And in this third Reconstruction, we need to kind of rethink how we are divided and conquered politically and start to build broader coalitions. So that's my hope.
Okay, Professor?
Yeah, I want to just compliment Rabbi Michael. You're very articulate. Wow, isn't he eloquent? But so, you know, in terms of periods of time where people fall into apathy, you know, my university is a majority Latino. And we have a lot of dreamers in our student body. And I remember the day after Trump won, and I was, you know, coming to the class, one of my classes is called Faith and Race in America. And we had Latino students just, you know, I asked the class, you know, how, you know, what are your reactions? And we had people crying, lots of people just crying. And they said, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to handle this. We don't know, you know, the world's going to fall apart. And I realized that they didn't know what to do because they were complacent under Obama, right? They were complacent for 8 years. And for them, if they were coming to my class at the age of 20, that would mean, you know, most of their, and all of their adult life and most of their, if not all of their teen years, they thought everything was okay for that, you know, group. And so it was quite a shock to them to realize that they now had to do something. And you know, I remember just coming and reminding them of all the types of activities that they could do. And I think it is, you know, I hope people remember those activities. I hope they don't just fall into complacency. You know, those that are more liberal, I hope they don't fall into complacency. And, you know, I wish we could get beyond, as Rabbi Michael was saying, getting beyond the blue and the red. And it's, of course, the lines are not just on elites and working class, but educated and non-educated and rural, suburban. You know, there's so many lines. There's so many lines. And yeah, you know, it is very hard for us. I think one question that's been plaguing me is it's very hard for me to get into the mindset of, for example, you know, the mythology of the QAnon people. I don't understand how they created such a closed bubble. And then that brings up the question, do we all live in our closed bubbles? I don't feel like I do, but what do you guys think?
I'm afraid to answer that last question.
So, Ibrahim, I put you off. It is now your turn.
Thank you. So a note on justice, that an intra-Muslim experience. So there is this concept of justice, absolute, clear, and uncompromisable, ideally. But over the ages, as political centers of power became more and more influential, there developed a concept of relative justice, which means we will not be, we cannot, which
Ibrahim,
means,
hold on. You're
okay,
competing with somebody who is
yeah,
not
he's muted. Yeah, he's muted.
Okay.
So which means, yeah, this absolute concept of justice is great, but there are these and these and these pressing circumstances which bring an exceptional situation where we should be satisfied with a relative form of justice. So what I am telling is a Muslim experience, at least in terms of my knowledge. It's a bitter experience. It's an intra-Muslim debate, but over the ages, these two approaches have clashed, even to the extent, to finish this note, to the extent that the Prophet's grandson and his close family being massacred by the monarch, because the Prophet's descendants were pushing for absolute justice, whereas the monarch was saying, it's a different age, we have a government to run, we have to build palaces, and sometimes my governors can be bribed, it's okay. So this clash is so fierce that it made the monarch slaughter the grandson of the Prophet. Absolute justice, relative justice.
Any comments from the panel on that statement?
Yeah, so when you use the term relative justice, I was using the term qualified justice, same thing.
It's a great tension. It's a great clash. And I'll post the link to this in the chat at some point. In 1974, Joe Biden was on a TV show, and this type of TV show does not exist anymore. It was basically a trial where he came in and sat in a witness's chair and answered questions and was cross-examined by the host, and then other experts came up. And so this was a very young Senator Biden. I think he was 28, 29, 30 years old at this time. And the subject is campaign finance reform. This is right after Watergate happened. This is when things are happening. This is when the FEC is forming. And a young Joe Biden, the interviewer starts off by saying, well, you're not corrupt, but let's talk about it. And Joe Biden goes, well, it's very nice of you to think that about me, but I wouldn't be so sure. And then he describes the system and how it works, and how he was only able to raise enough money to run for office because he was the token young person that year. Every election cycle, there's the token this or that that's able to fundraise on a nationwide scale and able to bring in money from all 50 states and run a campaign that way. And so that was him when he ran. And he said to stay in office, he needs to go to the powers that be and ask them for money. And if they're going to give him money, he just has to coincidentally agree with them. Just coincidentally happen to agree with whatever their position is, or else they're not going to give him money. And that's not stated, but it's unstated and it's real. And he says the problem you run into is you start to compromise here, and then you do it again, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And before you know it, you're looking in the mirror and you don't know who you're seeing. You've lost yourself. And so when we have these kind of systemic injustices, like our money and politics situation, everything just kind of trends toward injustice. And so it's easy to, at every step of the way, say, well, at least it's me in power and not that crazy person over there. Or, well, you know, I'm only doing this so that I can help people in my city, and I'm going to do a great thing there. And after a while, you're known as the senator from MasterCard. After a while, you've just compromised until there's not much left. And so I probably would be killed by the monarch, I would guess. So would be the would have gone.
So I'm looking at the chat room. I'm not seeing anybody. Please just say call on me with a question or a comment. So I have another question. Not everyone who is on this Zoom call is a senator, state or federal. Not everyone is an executive director of a organization that fights injustice. Not everyone is a professor who explores the roots of injustice. For the rest of us who are busy earning a living doing any number of things, right? Any number of things. What would you say are the most efficient uses of our time if we want to effectively resist injustice? Because we don't have as much time as you do. What would you say are the most effective uses that are efficient? Sorry. You're both muted.
First, what is your skill set? What can you bring to the table is important. So, Dan, if I may use you as an example, you're a lawyer. You have a legal mind. You have expertise. You can read policy and understand it and comment on it and inform people about it.
I'm a bad example because I actually work for justice.
That's
so maybe you're someone who's, yeah.
Literally in the Department of Justice. So depending on what your skill set is, that's probably going to determine how you can most be helpful. Some people have a marketing mind, have graphic design skills, have social media skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So bringing that to the table is helpful. I will say, just from knowing how Harrisburg works, not so much DC, phone calls don't really go that far. Emails don't really go that far. Petitions are probably the lowest form of engagement. Petitions often don't get delivered to the legislator. They're just there to collect your email address so that they can email you next week and ask for money. So really, in-person stuff is always the most effective. Really forcing that encounter however you can, and it's extremely possible to do this for 2 hours a week, to do this for 4 hours a week, to do this for 30 minutes a week.
Slow down. So a lot of people on this call do not live in Annapolis or Richmond. Some of them don't even live in Washington like me. Hard to get to Richmond. Maybe Annapolis isn't so hard. What would you suggest people do?
First step, get organized and get educated. So pick an issue area to focus in on. I, of course, will suggest democracy, but healthcare, ecological devastation, there's plenty of issue areas to zoom in on. Find something that you can do to change it. Find a bill, find an idea, find a law, and organize around it. So for example, in Maryland, there is a ranked choice voting campaign that is underway. There's a group out there that's organizing to bring ranked choice voting to Maryland. They need to convince the state assembly to do that, to pass that. You don't need to go to Annapolis. They have district offices, right? There's a district office close to everybody. Theoretically there is, but you need to be part of an organized group, because as an individual, as Herb was saying, as an individual, you can't really do much. It's about collective action.
And I want to add two things. One is that even if you join a group or you're already in a group, right? For example, the Hizmet movement, the Turkish government has created a lot of refugees out of the, Hizmet movement peoples, has scapegoated them. And one piece of advice that I've given them is to, when they create organizations for their refugees, to network with other organizations for refugees in general. Because you're stronger, the more you create the more you become a super node by creating connections with other groups, that actually makes you more powerful. So that's one. The other thing that I think people should do is to support courses in ethnic studies and religious studies at the high school level and also at the university level. These departments are always very small and they're always in danger of being cut. There's a lot of forces working against them. And if you don't have people, you know, graduating from high school, knowing the first thing about Judaism or Jewish culture or Islam, Islamic culture, you know, this is a problem. They only know what they know from the internet or from the news or from their little news bubble. It's a terrible problem. I think that one way to get out of our bubbles is still through education, still through public education. So I would emphasize focusing on that as well.
So, Professor, that's my obsession. I actually have a degree in education. And one of the things that we do every year is we bring the rabbis and imams together in the city. We're going to do it in 2 weeks. And one year I had a vote as to whether they want to talk about hate speech, environmental protection, or things like comparative religion and education. That one got 0 votes. 0. But it is my obsession. I wanted to make sure it was included.
And I just
So let
want
me
to add
ask
on.
you this question about my obsession, okay? I'm also published in Phi Delta Kappan, which is an educational journal. What do you say to those people who say, that's a lovely idea? Are you anti-science? Are you anti-economics? When some countries are getting more and more technologically advanced and science savvy, you want our high school kids to devote their time to religion and gender and ethnic studies? They don't have all day. They're programmed enough. I mean, I bet you hear that in California. I bet you hear that a lot in California.
Yes, yeah. It's hard. Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously on this subject, you see me wanting to explode. I mean, you can you can teach somebody how to build a dam, but you can't, you know, in that same class is not likely to talk about who's displaced by that dam or the environmental damage that will be created by that dam. So you need to look at education as, you know, holistically. Of course, we, you know, you have STEM and the focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. And I'm not worried about them. They're doing fine. They get most of the money from the university. So we don't need to get a violin for STEM. It's really the other, you know, it is women's studies, gender studies, ethnic studies, history, poli-sci, psychology. It's all these other departments that are being cut, especially the smaller ones like ethnic studies. And so, you know, I have students that they've never heard about Malcolm X. They didn't know the first thing about Malcolm X. And they graduate from high school not knowing about Malcolm X. This is incredible. How could they do that? You know, or they don't know that there's, you know, they think that Judaism is the 3rd world's largest religion. And I tell them, no, you know, let's look at this pie chart. You know, they just don't know. And this type of illiteracy is fatal. It's absolutely fatal.
I hear you.
In a Heschel quote here. He said, we teach our kids how to build great machines, but not how to conquer the greed and envy that exists in every human heart. And we really need to focus on that. And to another George Carlin quote here, he once said, we teach people to be smart enough to work the machines and keep the books, but dumb enough to not realize that they're being screwed.
2 of my favorite people, George Carlin and Heschel. All right, so Lucy's gold iPad had a comment about in-person advocacy being prohibited in Annapolis. Lucy, do you want to add to that or not? It's up to you.
It's just that we need to be more creative this year about how we do our advocacy work, because we're not able, due to COVID, to actually go to the state capitol. That's probably true in other states as well, and I'm simply suggesting that we may have to resort much more to the phone, to emails, and those kinds of things, and perhaps other ways of meeting with our legislators. But just a note of caution. There's always another challenge, but we'll get there.
Forcing the encounter is really hard in a pandemic. It's very, very, very hard. We've been setting up a lot of Zoom calls in Pennsylvania to do this, but it's just a different thing, and it's so much harder. And on a Zoom call, the senator or the representative, they can hide behind their staff a lot better. You can't just stare them down and go, I'm talking to you, John. You can't do that over Zoom. But we have to be creative. Yeah.
It's been great today. This has been a fantastic presentation from everybody. Thank you.
So I'm going to skip you for a second because there's a couple of people who haven't spoken yet. Shoshana, would you like to say something more about what's in your chat?
Not really. I think it speaks for itself.
Okay. Start with a golden rule, which is something that all these faiths, I assume, believe in, and a number of philosophers have adopted as well. Teresa. Teresa's next.
Just quickly quip.
Oh, she has to leave. Sorry. So go ahead, Rabbi.
No, just in politics, Dennis Kucinich has said this. A lot of people have said this. They follow the wrong golden rule. The guy with the gold makes the rules. And I like to kind of contrast it's human rights versus property rights, the two different golden rules. It's idolatry, in another word.
Prophets with a PH and with an F. All right, Herb, go ahead.
I just made a comment about the most effective way to lobby, which is not to cite facts, but to tell stories. If you tell a story that's personal or makes your point, then you've given the legislator, you've touched the legislator's heart, but more importantly, you've given the legislator a tool that when they go to talk about the issue, they can tell the story.
I'm talking a lot, but I'm just going to weigh in on this with a story from lobbying of the power of metaphor as well to touch people's hearts, the power to really make people cry, make politicians feel something. One time we were lobbying for the gift ban, and the legislator was doing what a lot of them do, which is distract, deflect the issue, change the subject, throw out a wedge issue, hope you come down on the wrong side of it so they can argue you out of the room and end the meeting. And this legislator brought out elephant poaching as his subject that he wanted to talk about. And he said, why are we cracking down on elephant poaching? This is such a great thing. Why are we doing this? And we said, we're here to talk about the gift ban. Redirected him. He went off again. Why are they doing this? He took out a black and white photo of him from about 40 years ago standing over a dead elephant with a rifle. And he said, this was the best thing that I ever did. Why is this wrong? And we just kept reframing him. And then finally he had a wedding ring on and a picture of his family on his desk. And one of our people said, democracy is a lot like a marriage. It's a covenantal relationship between we the people and our elected officials, between government and governed. And this relationship is struggling. We're not hearing each other. We don't like each other. We say nasty things about each other. We don't trust each other. And if this relationship fails, the state fails. The whole thing falls apart. This relationship has to succeed. We have to make this work. And his demeanor completely changed. That metaphor, it touched his heart. He cares about his family. It made sense to him, and he became one of our champions on the gift ban. It's the power of metaphor and touching their hearts. It cannot be overstated. Thank you for that point.
And I want to add about the golden rule because, it's true what you said, Dan, about all of the different world religions having a golden rule. So in Islam, it's a hadith by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he says, none of you has faith until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And some critics have said, by brother, they meant fellow Muslim. But actually, many more liberal Muslims would say, absolutely not. It's just any other person. Any other person. You don't have faith unless you want for the other person what you love for yourself. And there's another hadith that says, help your brother whether he's an oppressor or is oppressed. And so then the Prophet asked about this, is it like, we get it, like about helping the person who's oppressed, but how can we help an oppressor? And the answer is to help him stop oppressing.
So your first statement, the first hadith, reminds me of a debate within Orthodox Judaism today, when it says that if you take one life, it's like taking a whole world. And then some say, well, that's one Jewish life, and others say, well, that means one human life. Yeah. So there's so many parallels in these faiths. We keep seeing that in this work we're doing. So I see Ava, Ramon, and Ava, and then Rachel. Ramon or Ava, one of you had a point in the chat about voice. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, the Virginia Organization of Interfaith Community Engagement. They have really amped up their efforts to influence legislators. And as a member of Temple Road of Shalom, our Social Action Committee has really worked hard to work with them. And as your point was, to be more effective through alliances with similar-minded organizations. So I would encourage anyone in Virginia, certainly, to get interested and participate. They even will have training sessions. So they're really committed, and we have been successful, and so we will move forward. Thank you.
So Rachel, before you start, how many of you people love George Carlin? Are you all big George Carlin fans? So yeah. I take it you have a sense of humor, kind of a twisted sense of humor?
Oh,
all right. All right, here's a twisted joke. This is the first time in history that JIDS and an organization called Jamaat, Jews and Muslims and Allies, what is it, the action? What is the last word? Working together.
Acting together.
Acting together. Jews and Muslims and Allies acting together. This is the first time in history JIDS and Jamaat have had an event at the same time. That's not funny. We screwed up. But George Carlin would be laughing. So sorry about that, folks. It has never happened before, and I hope it won't happen again. Rachel, fewer people will hear you because of that. But please, we're listening.
Now, I just wanted to say that one of the really important things that has to happen is that people have to awaken the young people to ideas that they didn't choose for themselves, because now we have this technological bubble that many youth are trapped inside, where they choose all of their own playlists and they don't really get challenged. You know, in the old days, you were in the car and you'd hear NPR because that's what your parents were listening to. And now you put on your headset and you choose what you want to listen to, and you don't even know there's anything else out there. And I think that it's the same kind of thing as we have to make alliances. We have to also find ways to let people know that there are things out there to link up with, and to help find ways to make sure that doesn't happen.
I absolutely agree with you, Rachel. I mean, this is so important. I wish I said it because I wish I said it first. Yeah, the youth are overwhelmed, especially during the pandemic. They're just so overwhelmed. You're just doing their homework, on Zoom, but to make them realize that, especially those in North America, are so incredibly privileged that their voice is important. Just letting them know that, no, it is important. And no, if you write a letter to your congressperson, they actually do read it. They count it. You must. And we are fighting against technology, and we are fighting against the internet. Not that the internet is evil, but just that it's very distracting.
Brave new world. Very quickly, how we got here is really important as well, because this system that we're operating, this media system, is set by policies that governments make. And in 1971, a man named Lewis Powell, who would shortly after become a Supreme Court justice, was brought in by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to author a memo on how to take on, quote, the excesses of democracy that the 1960s had shown. That's the language they use, the excess of democracy. And one of the things they did was how to take over the media and how to take over universities and how to fund chairs, and a few things that happened along the way. In the mid-1980s, we got rid of the fairness doctrine. It used to be that if you were in a media bubble, somebody would be able to come onto your show for the last 5 minutes and explain why, the other point of view. Rush Limbaugh could not exist with a fairness doctrine, because somebody would come on the last 5 minutes and just go, well, that was a load of nonsense. That was all completely wrong, which would be hilarious, right? He couldn't exist. Fox News couldn't exist. Then in 1996, under the Clinton administration, they passed the Telecommunications Act, which deregulated the media industry and allowed them to gobble each other up and further consolidate media, to allow corporations to merge with each other. And now the stat is 90% of everything that we see, hear, and read comes from 6 corporations. So we have an incredibly monopolized media scene that is allowed to exist in its own echo chambers. And those are policy decisions. And then also things like Facebook, YouTube, Facebook, Google, Amazon, right? We need to break up these monopolies. We need to break up these things that have consolidated so much of what we see, hear, and read.
So I have a question for you guys. Again, this is Washington, D.C. And we got something called the Washington Post. A number of us get something called the New York Times every day in addition to the Washington Post. People here listen to CNN. People here watch MSNBC. And when the youth that we were talking about a minute ago were like jumping towards a particular political candidate in or around, what was it, February of 2020.
Bernie.
The Washington Post, the New York Times, MSNBC, and CNN together, I think, collectively thought they were dealing with Vladimir Lenin or Joseph Stalin. Now, what do you say about that? I mean, that's, in this city, for the most part, people think that is as it should be, because they agreed with the decision of these individuals. They are literally of this group. But how do we get a just media? Is that even possible? I mean, what do you do about that?
There's a lot of good ideas out there on this front. First of all, when I hear MSNBC, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, that's millionaires being paid by billionaires to talk to the working class. And so the perspective that you're getting is not one that's conducive to healthcare as a human right or Green New Deal or these big things that we need to do, because you're getting the perspective of Jeff Bezos filtered through some other people who aren't necessarily as rich as he is. And there's a lot of things to do. Reinstating the fairness doctrine goes a long way. Breaking up media monopolies goes a long way. I heard, this is a fascinating idea. I heard Andrew Yang just talking about, he's universal basic income guy. How about media dollars? How about every U.S. resident gets $100 a year in credits and vouchers that they can then donate to local media sources, so that they can fund the local media, the local journalism that's actually in state houses, actually in city councils, actually watching things that are happening and reporting the truth. So there are things that we can do, and we need to move fast on that front.
Well, you said that so quickly before the professor starts. You said that so quickly. I mean, you've got to educate people. People have got to be educated about what they can do. Because you said that so quickly, I don't think a lot of people taking notes. But is there a place people can go to get these ideas, like a book that talks about this together?
Daring Democracy details the, which I put into the chat here. It details the Powell memo. It's a great book on this. And then I really recommend seeking non-corporate media sources. Democracy Now! Is a great news source. Amy Goodman just tells you the news. She just tells you what happens. The pundits, they talk about one issue for 24 straight hours and give you all sorts of speculation around it. The news is, different than that.
Professor.
Okay, so I do credit Bernie for working against corporate donations, which I think is right. But I'm not as big of a Bernie fan as some. Okay, and I think that those that bash New York Times, Washington Post, because I have a teenager who of course tells me that those are all just owned by corporate media, and that he gets his news from videos, and it disturbs me a little bit, okay, as an older person, because you can't, anybody can upload a video. So the news that he's getting, I don't know if it's reputable or not, but if you flat out lie, or you plagiarize the New York Times, Washington Post, you get fired, right? And then the whole newspaper loses some reputation. So I think it's a complex issue. I know Michael's going to say, no, they still do lie. I know you're going to say that.
And they don't get fired.
The question wasn't so much, should we support a candidate with ideology A or B or C? The question is more, does the mainstream media have a particular ideology which may or may not agree with oneself, whoever oneself is? I feel like John Rawls here asking the question. It shouldn't really matter what your political ideology is. The question is, should we choose to have the mainstream media all coming from the same place? Or is the question incorrect? And do you think the mainstream media was really coming from different places? Because what I heard was the same place.
I mean, of course, I tell my students to read all different newspapers, including international newspapers. That's the answers. You just have to, get your media from a variety of sources to be a well-rounded person. I check Fox News every once in a while just to see, what they're blathering on about. But, I just want to know what, and I was actually sort of pleasantly surprised when they called the election. Remember, they called the election, and even when Trump was denying the election, I thought that was actually a very good thing. So I'll let the rabbi take it from here. Go ahead, Michael.
I'll just say that the ruling class is not hegemonic in their ideology. There's diversity within the ruling class, and that's expressed in the spectrum from Fox News to MSNBC. A lot of people in the ruling class believe that LGBTQ people are human beings and deserve equal rights. A lot of them believe the opposite of that. It goes from Betsy DeVos all the way to so there is diversity within the ruling class, but that diversity is contained. The debate, the conversations are contained, right? They don't talk about climate change. They don't talk about wages. They don't talk about healthcare that much. They focus on issues that they care about, which is like, the court drama that's happening in the King's Court, the drama of the Duke who's stabbing the Lord in the back to take over the manor. It's soap opera stuff at a certain point. So yeah.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left, and maybe the best thing to do is to ask the two panelists if they have anything to say to sort of reflect on what's been said tonight, or reflect on what hasn't been said and needed to be said. So we started out with the professor. Let's this time start out with the rabbi.
I'm going to talk about hope, I guess. We need to talk about hope and despair, because without that, you can be very informed but inactive. The story of hope that I always go back to is the burning bush. We're approaching MLK Day here. So in April 3rd, 1968, the night before MLK was murdered in Memphis, Tennessee, he gave a very famous speech where he says, "I have been to the mountaintop, I have seen the other side." Earlier on in that speech, he said, he was talking about Bull Connor, the Southern sheriff, and he said, "Bull Connor does not understand history. Bull Connor does not understand that there is a certain there is a certain fire that no water hoses can put out, that there is a certain fire that water hoses cannot put out." And he's talking about the burning bush, because before you get to the mountaintop, you got to cross the desert, you got to go to Sinai, you got to get out of Egypt, you got to have the burning bush. And the burning bush was the moment where Moses became transformed from a criminal outcast refugee to Moses, right? He became Moses the hero. And 4 things happened at the burning bush, and I'm just going to briefly go through them, just as kind of a structure that I use in my day-to-day life to go from despair to hope. The first thing that happens is there's a moment of gratitude. There's a moment of awe. There's a moment of wonder. Moses is standing there, and he sees this thing, and he goes, "Oh my God, what is that? That's amazing." And he walks over and he takes off his sandals as a sign of standing on holy space. There's a moment of recognition that something special is happening here. And so starting off with gratitude, starting off with awe is very, very important to building hope. Then the second step is honestly acknowledging our suffering. God says, "I have heard the cries of the slaves. I have heard their moans. I have seen their suffering," right? We have to be able to look at the problem, or else we're not going to deal with it. And I believe it was Omar Safed who said, "The wound is where the light enters you," that the wound is where the light enters, and that you have to recognize the wound. And did I get that wrong?
It's Rumi, Mevlana Rumi.
That's Rumi. Oh, that's funny. Excellent. So you have to acknowledge the wound, or else nothing gets better. And then the third thing that happened at the burning bush was Moses was connected to a longer story that began before him and is going to end after him. He was not the whole book. He was just the middle chapter. God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's generations before. And one day you will reach a land flowing with milk and honey after you're dead. Moses is no longer, the whole world is not on his shoulders anymore. He's joined into a larger struggle across space and time. And we are all part of those longer struggles too. The struggle for American democracy, the struggle for justice. We have to find our place in these longer stories. And the fourth thing that happened was an action step. Go and organize the elders and talk to Pharaoh. Very simple directions, not, okay, here's every single little thing that's going to happen between now and the promised land. Because Moses would have been completely overwhelmed. That's way too much to handle, right? Just get your next step figured out and take it. It was the Roman poet Seneca said, if you do not know to which port you are sailing, there are no favorable winds. Meaning you have to know where you're headed and take that step in that direction. And the idea is, let's walk toward freedom. Let's walk toward justice. So stay hopeful, active hope.
So we have a couple more questions, but first we're going to hear from the professor, and then maybe if people can stay on for just a minute, we got a couple more people in the chat box.
Okay, so as a Muslim, I want to talk about jihad. There are two types of jihad. One is the external jihad, where you struggle to better society, and that could be just recycling your coffee cup or whatever. And it's very important to do so, for a Muslim to continue to struggle to better society. But actually, that's not the most important form of jihad. So I really want to emphasize the greater jihad, which is the jihad towards to control your own ego. We're all terrorists within. We are all oppressors, and we are all socially unjust at times within. If we think about the mistakes we've made with our family members and at the community level, we can see that very clearly. And I think I just want to leave us with, some attention to the micro level, to focusing on the greater jihad, which is to control our own, selfish, childlike person who just wants things, or wants to hurt, wants to have, wants power over, and doesn't necessarily want to share power, share crayons, share anything. So I think that's, I think it takes a certain form of mindfulness, even meditation. And I think that also leads to hope.
Okay, thank you. So there's a couple of statements here in the chat box. Steve Land, you want to start? I mean, you've made a statement, but you can make it out loud, however you want to do it.
My comment was really just to raise a point with Michael, because we agree that we have left and right news stories and everything. Let me go without saying about that. And of course, my hope was that we'd have Ted Turner back, or somebody who might start something. Please load the TV. Somebody who would, please load the TV. That we would have somebody who would be more balanced. But I would not say Amy Goodman is objective. I like Amy Goodman, nothing against her, but she's even to the left sometimes for CNBC. That was my only comment I was making. But the real message is we do need an objective news station, but we can't expect the American people to go switching between channels.
Absolutely, and as close to objectivity as is humanly possible is necessary.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay.
I would push back on, I don't want Bezos and Murdoch to come together. I don't want the two wings of the ruling class to tell me what to think. I want this to come from a non-profit driven media.
We agree.
Ramon or Ava, I don't know who the question was coming from or the comment was coming. Actually, it's a question. Would you care to ask it out loud?
Yes, I would. The entertainment industry has programs now for artists and singers to promote consciousness raising songs that promote social action and political participation. And I think that's a positive trend. Like the singers from Qatar going to Tel Aviv performances, or the entertainments from the US going to Mecca to share common songs that promote the positive aspect of the holy books. And I think our temples are participating, our synagogues, our mosques, also the Viharas in Buddhism, trying to bring in songs to include the young generations. And I think when we involve the young generations, consciousness raising through songs and entertainment, movies, it provides the positive change in the world. And so maybe the panel can comment on what more we can do to include this type of trend. Thank you.
They have to unmute themselves first.
And you're talking about like cross-cultural visiting or interfaith dialogue, that type of thing?
Right, and also doing programs that, more Zoom programs, more movies, more educational changes in the curriculum to teach civic education, spiritual positive parables, and the stories from the Torah and the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita. So yes.
How do we make that happen?
And I did speak to that. I really do encourage us to have a world religion class at the public high school level. Catholic schools are really great at teaching world religion, but public schools don't teach it at all. I don't know if you are aware of this. They don't teach it at all. But I agree with you. We need a value-laden education. Mm-hmm. And that's at risk right now, especially as we Costcoize education. And this is getting worse right now because of the pandemic. Everybody's on Zoom. In fact, I'm taking this course for how to teach courses on Zoom, and it's so formulaic. The personal touch is missing, and definitely the idea that we would imbue values into our education. There is a danger. There's a massive danger here. And I'll let Rabbi.
I love that phrase, the Costcoization of education. That's great. Yeah, I'll just add civics is something that I'm particularly passionate about. That's been cut from most curriculum over the last couple of decades and is extremely, extremely important. And I'll also just add the struggle is the classroom. The movement is the classroom. And so as we're fighting for justice, we're learning a lot, and education needs to be a part of those struggles. Cross-cultural exchanges are incredible. Interfaith Dialogue Center, it's what we're doing right here, are absolutely incredible. And there needs to be that action step that goes along with these institutions, because people really do form those relationships when they're fighting for issues of common concern. My kid's school is suffering, your kid's school is suffering. We're coming together across cultures to talk about that. Let's do something about that together. And when you show up across cultures, when you show up across lines of division in a politician's office, it scares them a bit. They don't like it.
I will say to Ramon that fear, extreme fear, is not monopolized by the political right. When I was in my 20s, which was at some point way back, and I was writing about needing to teach religion in the public schools, I heard from a lot of liberals that, oh my God, we can't do that, because then this will just be a way to establish Christianity as the national religion. They will never do it neutrally the way you're proposing. And I heard that over and over again. So it's hard to fight City Hall. It's hard to propose significant reforms. There are so many people fighting for the status quo, which is why what these guys are doing is so important. And I hope we've all learned from them tonight. I hope somehow we can save the chat, because these books in particular are books we need to read. And I, for one, didn't get all the names. So somehow we have to figure out a way. But did you all put your email addresses up for people to at least email you? Because we're coming from different organizations, JIDS and Rumi. And I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to email them and to write down these books and to actually read these books and somehow get involved in resisting injustice, because all hands need to be on deck.
This chat has 3
Please.
dots. So that means if you click on those 3 dots, theoretically, it saves the chat to some file on your computer.
Okay.
So if you see that it says, like there's a little thing that says file and right at the bottom of the chat if you're on a computer, and 3 dots. And if you click on those, it supposedly saves the chat in a file that's called Zoom, something in the name of whatever this meeting is.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and I think,
just did.
I guess you have all the emails from the registration, but I'm not sure what happens. Isn't that a part of what we had to fill to get the admission to the Zoom?
Yeah, they are on our Eventbrite record. So we have the party
Oh.
registrant emails.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the chat has been saved. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to thank all of you for participating tonight. I want to thank in particular the panelists. And early on in the chat, we put in and we talked about our next events. Please check out both the Rumi Forum and the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society of Washington. And hopefully you will not live long enough to ever again see Jamaat and JIDS have an event at the same time. So organize and come together is the theme, I think, of the evening, and that is not one way of doing it. So thank you again. It was a wonderful session and very much appreciate it.
I just wanted to clap.
Thank you.
Thanks to you. Thanks to the JIDS and to the Rumi Forum.
Things
Very much.
Thank you all.
Stay
Take
safe,
care.
everyone. Have a great week.